sent across the border in a locked freight car. A Lakota chief broke the seal at the Rio Grande. The seal was a strip of red wax, government-stamped, pressed into the iron clasp like the whole U.S. Army was standing behind it. I broke it with my thumb. My name is Chayton. My father named me for the hawk. I have carried that name through 3 decades of watching what the hawk watches, the long grass below, the thing that moves when it thinks nothing is looking. I was 49 years old that summer at the Rio Grande, and I had learned by then that a red wax seal pressed by a white man's hand did not mean a thing was right. It only meant a man with a pen had decided it was convenient. The car had come down from Tucson on the Southern Pacific Line, rerouted at El Paso to cross the border and unload at a depot in Chihuahua. 3 cars on that train were carrying freight. 2 of them were crates. The third one had air holes punched in the side panels, just below the roofline, which crates do not need. I had not come to that depot to find her. I want to be clear about that. I had come because a man named Reuben Cross owed me $400 for 8 months of grazing rights on my land, and Cross worked that depot. He ran freight for the Southern Pacific, kept the manifests, took the cuts. Cross and I had done business before, not friendly business, but business. I found him in the depot office with his boots on the desk and a cup of coffee going cold. He saw me come through the door, and his face did what white men's faces did when they saw me walk into a room they thought was theirs, a kind of hardening, a rearrangement. He owed me money and he knew I knew he knew it, and still he let his chin come up the way men do when they're about to tell you they've got more right to the air in the room than you do. We settled the money, not easily, but we settled it. I was turning to leave when I heard it. Not loud, not a scream. Something smaller and worse, the flat, exhausted sound a person makes when they have been making noise for a long time and the noise has stopped mattering to them. A knock, then silence, then the knock again. Coming from the locked freight car on the eastern siding. Cross didn't look at the car, he looked at his coffee. That was the tell. I walked over to the car. The seal was on the clasp. U.S. government issue, red, stamped with the eagle. I looked at it for a moment. I thought about the $400 folded in my shirt pocket. I thought about the 11 men at my camp 3 miles north who were waiting on me. I thought about the last time I had walked away from a thing because it was someone else's problem, and what that had cost me, and what it had cost the people who depended on me to not walk away. I broke the seal. The door took both hands to slide. Heavy iron, rusted in its track, and when it opened the smell hit me first. Not death, close to it. Heat and fouled water and human sweat, and the particular sourness of fear that has had days to settle into wood. She was in the back corner, sitting upright with her knees drawn in, which told me she still had enough left in her to hold herself together. Her hands were tied in front, not behind. Someone had been lazy, or someone had not thought she was worth the trouble of doing it right. Her hair was dark, half down, stuck to the side of her face. She was looking at me the way people look when they have been found so many times by the wrong kind of person that being found has stopped feeling like rescue. I did not move toward her. I stood in the door and let the light come in around me. I said in English, "I'm going to cut that rope, then I'm going to step back. You can do whatever you want after that." She didn't answer, but her eyes changed, the smallest shift, like a door unlatching somewhere behind them. I came forward slow, and I cut the rope with my belt knife. I stepped back. I sat down on a crate near the door and I waited. She got up in stages, first to her knees, then to her feet, one hand on the wall of the car. She walked to the door and stood in it, looking out at the depot. Cross was in his office window. He was watching us. He was also not moving, which meant he had decided what was happening wasn't worth whatever it would cost him to try to stop it. I had done business with him long enough to know that was the only calculation he ever ran. She said, still looking at the depot, "Do you work for them?" I said no. She said, "Then who do you work for?" I said, "Nobody. I work for myself and for my people." She turned and looked at me then, the first real look, not the cornered animal look but the measuring kind. She looked at my face and my hands and the knife on my belt, and whatever she was calculating, she did it fast and she trusted the result. She said, "I need water." I said, "My camp is 3 miles north. We ride, you'll have water in an hour." She said, "I don't know you." I said, "No, you don't. But you've got a choice of what you know and what you don't, and the man in that window knows you're standing here, and the train that brought you is due back through at sundown." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "What's your name?" I told her, "Chaitin." She said, "Margaret Voss." I said, "Can you ride?" She looked out across the depot yard at my horse tied to the post. She looked at herself, at her hands where the rope had been, at the ground from the freight car door to the yard below. Then she looked back at me. She said, "Help me down." I put my hand out and she took it, and that was how we started. The camp was on the north side of a low bluff above the river, where the cottonwoods came down thick enough to break the wind. I'd been wintering near the Rio Grande for 6 years by then, long enough that the Mexican ranchers south of the river had stopped riding fence when they saw our fires, and the Anglo ranchers north had stopped sending their hands to tell us to move on. Not because they liked us. Because they had learned that telling us to move had a cost attached to it, and the cost was not one they wanted to keep paying. 11 men in that camp. 3 were Lakota, like me, Hoka, Sunka Witko, who we called Shunkaha, and my nephew Elan, who was 22 and still had the kind of anger that wanted to be fire and hadn't yet learned that a low, steady heat does more work. The others were Crow, Shoshone, 2 mestizo brothers from Sonora named Diego and Aurelio, and an old white man from Tennessee named Cobb who had been with us for 4 years, and who would tell you, if you asked, that he had stopped being a white man about 3 years ago and hadn't noticed until it was done. They saw me come in with her, and nobody said a word. That is something I want you to understand about the men I kept. I did not keep men who asked the wrong questions. I did not have to tell them, "This woman is with us now, she is not a prisoner, she is not to be looked at sideways." They read it from the way I rode with her, not ahead of her, alongside, and from the way I brought her to the water first, before I even unsaddled my horse. They read it and they accepted it and they went back to what they were doing. That is what a man earns when he has led well for a long time, not obedience, something better than obedience, trust in his judgment exercised quietly. She drank. She drank a long time, and I watched her hands stop shaking while she drank, which was the first sign. Then she sat back from the river and looked up at the cottonwoods and the sky, and she breathed, a long, pulled-in breath, held, let out slow, like a person who has been holding themselves very small for a long time and has just been given permission to take up space again. She asked me that evening. We were at the fire. The others had pulled back out of courtesy. She asked me what I expected for what I'd done. I said nothing. She said, "That's not an answer." I said, "I broke a seal and cut a rope. That doesn't buy me anything." She looked at the fire. She said, "The men who put me in that car were going to sell me in Chihuahua. There was a buyer. I had a price." I said, "I know." She said, "And you just opened the door." I said, "The door needed opening." She looked at me, then the way she'd looked at me the first time, that measuring look. But this time there was something else in it, not softness, something more careful than softness, like a person handling something they've decided might be worth being careful with. She said, "You could have gone around the car, could have pretended you didn't hear." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why didn't you?" I said, "Because I did hear, and I have spent too many years walking past things I heard. I'm not built for it anymore." She didn't say anything to that. She just looked at the fire. After a while she said, "Do you have any tobacco?" I did. We smoked together and the fire burned down and the night got cold, and that was all. No more talking. Just the fire and the cold and the sound of the river and the knowledge. which I had already settled in myself without saying it out loud, that I was not going to let anything happen to this woman. She had been a schoolteacher in Tucson. She'd been there 8 years, came west from Ohio when she was 26 with her brother, who had lasted 3 years before the country broke him and he went back. She had stayed, taught at the schoolhouse on Mesquite Street. The children were Mexican and Pima and Anglo, mixed in together the way they were in that part of Tucson, and she said she had liked that, liked the way children didn't yet know they were supposed to sort themselves by blood. She had been taken from her house on a Wednesday night in March, 2 men. She didn't know them. She knew the man who had sent them, a freight operator named Hendricks, who had been pressing her for a year and who had, she told me, the particular kind of pride that cannot survive being told no. He had decided that if she would not come to him willingly, he would arrange for her to be somewhere else entirely, somewhere that the word no had no weight. She told me all of this over 3 days, not in one telling but in pieces, the way people tell hard things, a piece here, then silence, then another piece when the silence had done enough work. I listened the way I had learned to listen, without filling in the spaces, without reaching for her to tell it faster or different. On the 4th morning she woke before anyone else, and she was sitting by the dead fire when I came out of my blankets. She had rebuilt it already. Small, precise fire, dry wood stacked the way I'd shown her the night before, tight at the base, open at the top to draw. I sat down across from it, and she poured me coffee from the pot she'd already set to boil. I said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "I know." I said, "You're not here to cook for us." She said, "I know that too. I wanted to do something. I'm not good at sitting still and being a burden." I said, "You're not a burden." She said, "Not yet, but I will be if I don't carry something." I said, "Then carry what you want to carry and leave what you don't." She looked at me over the rim of her cup, and there was the beginning of something in her face. Not a smile, not yet, but the precursor to one, the thing that comes before the thaw. She said, "You're a strange man, Chaitin." I said, "I've been told." She said, "I mean that as a compliment." I said, "I know." We were 3 days from the border when the trouble found us. It was always going to find us. That is one thing I had learned early and never unlearned. When you are the kind of man I was, moving through the kind of country I moved through, carrying the kind of history I carried, trouble does not need to be invited. It comes on its own schedule. They were Hendricks's men. 4 of them, hired south of El Paso, riding hard across the desert on fresh horses. They had the freight car Manifest. Cross had sold them that. I found out later, though what Cross got for it I never knew. And they had a rough bearing from a vaquero who had seen us cross the river. They came into our camp at midday, which was either brave or stupid. I was inclined to say stupid, because they came in with their rifles out, which is the kind of thing that works in a dime novel, and does not work when you ride into a camp of 11 men who know the ground. Elan was on the bluff above the south approach. Shunkaha was in the cottonwoods on the east. The 2 Sonora brothers had come around behind them before the lead rider opened his mouth. But it was Margaret who stepped forward. I want you to understand this. I was standing at the fire. She was 20 feet away by the horses, brushing down my gray. The lead rider came in with his rifle pointed roughly at the center of the camp, not at anyone specific, the way men do when they want to be threatening without committing to a target, and he said, "We're looking for the woman." Nobody moved. He said it again, louder. "The woman. The one this man," and he pointed at me, "the one this man took from the freight depot at the Rio Grande." And Margaret Voss put down the brush, turned around and walked toward him. I moved. I stepped between them, not fast, just decisively, the way you step in front of something to say, "This is where it stops." She put her hand on my arm, not pulling me back. She wasn't stopping me. She was placing herself beside me, her shoulder against my arm. Standing there the same way the cottonwoods stood beside the river, not performing anything, just present. She said, looking up at the rider, I wasn't taken from that car. I was released, and I'm here because I choose to be. The rider looked at her, then at me, then at the 11 men who had materialized around his fore in the way water materializes around a thing dropped into it. He said, Hendricks paid good money for you. She said, then Hendricks is out good money. The rider looked at me again. He was making his calculation, the same one Cross had made at the depot window. What is this going to cost me? He had 4 men on open ground, against 11 who knew the terrain, and the woman had already said what she meant, and the man she was standing next to had not said a word and had not needed to. The rider lowered his rifle. He said to me, this isn't over. I said, it is for today. And they rode out. I didn't watch them go. I was watching her. She was watching them go straight-backed, hands still on my arm, watching until the dust swallowed them. Then she breathed out, a long exhale, and her hand tightened on my arm for just a second before she let go. She said, thank you. I said, you did that. She said, we did that. I said, yes. That night she asked me about my people. She asked the way a real person asks, not the way people had been asking me for 30 years, which was the way you ask about something you've already decided is a curiosity, a museum piece, a kind of weather phenomenon. She asked like she wanted to know about real people, their names and their troubles and the things they laughed about. I told her about the winter of '83, when we'd lost the North Pasture to a land office ruling that had been bought and paid for by a cattle operation out of Denver, and how we had moved south and built again. I told her about my daughter Mika, who was 17 and who could read 3 languages and who wanted to go to school in Santa Fe, and how I had been putting money aside for that for 4 years. I told her about the summer fire of '86 that took 2 men and a season's worth of work, and how we had rebuilt the fences and the corrals by November, and how when the last post went into the ground, I had stood there in the cold and felt something that wasn't pride, exactly, more like proof. Like the land itself had witnessed something. She listened to all of it. She asked questions that showed she had been listening, not surface questions, the deeper kind, the kind that reach into the thing you said and pull on what's underneath it. She said, you've carried a lot of this alone. I said, not alone, with my men, my daughter. She said, but the weight of it, the deciding who else does that. I looked at the fire. I said, no one else. She said, does it get heavy? I said, yes. She said, what do you do when it does? I said, I remember why it's mine to carry, and then I carry it. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I'd like to help with that. I looked at her. She said, I'm not asking for anything from you. I know this is your camp and your life and I'm someone you pulled out of a freight car a week ago. I know that. But I'm not helpless and I'm not weak, and I would like, if you'd let me, to be useful to you, to be something more than a problem you solved. I said, you're not a problem. She said, you know what I mean. I did know what she meant. I had been feeling it too, in the way things become known to a man not all at once but in accumulation, each morning, when she had the fire going before I was up, each evening when she sat at the edge of the circle, and the men talked around her with the ease they showed to someone who had earned a place. Each time she looked at me, and I felt the weight she mentioned, the weight I had always carried alone, become, in some small unmeasured way, lighter. I said, you can stay as long as you want to stay. She said, I want to stay. I said, then that's settled. She looked at me with that measuring look, but different this time. Not calculating, not guarding, something open in it, something that had decided the calculation was done and the result was worth the risk. She said, you're a good man, Chaitan. I said, I try to be. She said, you are. Whatever you think about yourself, you are. We rode north in late June. The camp broke down the way a well-run camp breaks down, each man knowing his task, nothing wasted, no ceremony, just the quiet efficiency of men who have done this together before. The horses were loaded. The gear was stowed. The fire pit was turned under. By noon the bluff showed no sign we had ever been there, which was how I liked it. I had been leaving land like that for 30 years clean, as if we had been wind rather than men. Margaret rode beside me on the bay gelding we'd picked up in Presidio. She rode straight and easy, which she hadn't when we'd started. In the beginning she'd been tentative in the saddle, gripping too hard, fighting the horse rather than moving with it. 3 weeks had changed that. She rode like the country had agreed to her. Elan came up on my left and said, "Quiet, she's good." I said, "Yes." He said, "You keeping her?" I said, "That's her decision." He looked across at her and back at me, and he had his father's face when he thought he was hiding something, which was my brother's face, which meant he was terrible at it. He said, "You're hoping she decides yes." I said, "Ride ahead and check the North Passage." He grinned and rode ahead. She had heard it. She was looking forward, at the long country opening up ahead of us, but the corner of her mouth was doing something. I said, "Don't." She said, "I wasn't going to say anything." I said, "Good." She said, "He's not wrong, though." I didn't answer. She said, still looking ahead, "I already decided." I said, "I know." She said, "Then why are you acting like you don't?" I said, "Because there's a difference between knowing a thing and it being said out loud. Some things you need to let settle before they can carry weight." She thought about that. She said, "Fair enough." We rode a while. The country came up around us, the high desert, the broken stone, the sky that was the particular dense blue it got in June before the monsoons, the color of something that has never been anything but enormous. She said, "After Santa Fe, when Mika starts school." I said, "What about it?" She said, "I'd like to see what comes after that, with you." I looked at her. She was looking at the country, and there was something in the way she sat there on that horse in that light, straight-backed, quiet, the dust of the trail on her coat, her hands easy on the reins. That was the most settled and right thing I had seen in a long time. Not soft at all, just right. I said, "Then we'll see what comes." She said, "I'm counting on it." We reached the home range in late July. The territory north of the Sangre de Cristos, 40,000 acres of grass and stone, and cedar that I had been building on for 11 years. The ranch buildings were low and solid. Adobe walls 2 feet thick, a barn of cedar and iron, a corral where we kept the working horses, a cookhouse, and the main house where my daughter Mika came running out before we'd cleared the gate. She was 17 and tall, and she had her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, which made her formidable and occasionally insufferable, and she was the best thing I had ever been part of making. She threw her arms around me the way she hadn't since she was 12, unself-consciously, all of her, and I held her and felt the particular weight of that, the specific gravity of a daughter who still trusts you. She pulled back and looked at Margaret. She said, "You're the one he went to get." Margaret looked at me. I said, "I went to collect money owed." Mika said, "He came back with you." Margaret said, "Yes." Mika said, "I'm glad he did." There was a moment between them, the two of them measuring each other the same way, the same direct, quick assessment look. And then Mika nodded, once, in the way she nodded when something had passed inspection, and she said, "Come in, I'll show you where you can wash up," and that was that. I stood by the gate and watched them go inside together. 2 women walking into my house. The smaller one talking already, the taller one listening with her head tilted, the way she listened when she was deciding whether to trust what she was hearing. Cobb came up beside me with 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one. He said, "You did good down there." I said, "She did most of it." He said, "She found a good man to stand beside." I didn't answer. I drank my coffee and watched the door where they'd gone in and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into the evening, the horses in the corral, a hawk calling somewhere above the mesa, the smell of juniper smoke already coming from the cookhouse chimney. I was 49 years old. I had built this place with 11 years of hard work and a clear sense of what I owed my people and what I owed myself. I had carried the weight of it the only way I knew how to carry it, straight-backed, eyes forward, without asking anyone to take a share. That evening, when the cook fire was lit and the men were settling for the night, and the desert had gone from red to purple to the deep layered dark it became after sundown, Margaret came out and stood beside me at the fence. She didn't take my arm or say anything. She just stood there, looking at the same dark country I was looking at, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her. After a while she said, "It's beautiful." I said, "Yes." She said, "You built this." I said, "My men built this with me." She said, "You know what I mean." I did know what she meant. The same way I knew what Cobb had meant, what Elan had meant with that grin, what Mika had meant when she'd nodded her quick nod of approval. They all meant the same thing, that this was real, that the man who had built it was real. That a woman who had been across the border in a locked freight car and had found her way back to herself had stood in the firelight of his camp and made a choice. And the choice was him, and that was worth something that did not need a word as small as worth. She put her hand on the top rail of the fence. I put mine over it, not making anything of it, just that. The stars came out. The way they come out in that country, not gradually, the way they do back east, but all at once, as if the sky has decided to be honest about how many of them there are. I didn't move my hand. She didn't move hers. And the ranch settled around us in the dark, and the hawk called again from somewhere up above the mesa, and the world that had been trying for 30 years to break me down went on being large and indifferent and mine to navigate. And for the first time in a long time, I was not navigating it alone. That is what I wanted to tell you. That is all of it. You take a man who has carried his life with both hands for 49 years, carried it through loss and displacement, and the grinding kind of injustice that does not come all at once but wears at a man the way water wears at stone, and you give him a night like that, a fence rail, a hand that chose to stay where it was. A woman who is not soft, is not fragile, is not grateful in the small diminished way of someone who owes you something, but who is strong and knows what she wants and looked at you in the firelight of a camp in the desert and said, "Yes, that one. I choose that one." You give a man that after all of it. He tends to hold it careful. He tends to make sure he deserves it. He tends to become, in the years after, the kind of man she was right to choose. That's what happened to me.